Every person in that ER stopped breathing. They didn't need to see the midnight blue suit to know that death had just walked in. In his world, a request was a command, and a mistake was a funeral. Not a single doctor moved. Not a single orderly breathed. Except Hawa, she didn't flinch as the heavy glass doors shattered. She didn't blink at the white-knuckled grip Myung had on his dying brother. While the rest of the staff retreated, Hawa Tolbert stepped into the light. She walked straight toward the most feared man in the city, looked past his bloodshot eyes like they were furniture, and pushed her gurney into his path. She didn't see a mafia boss. She saw a patient whose blood was turning a synthetic, oily black. He had spent his life being feared or hunted, but he had never been ignored. What Sang didn't know then was that this nurse was the only person on Earth who could recognize the ghost Toxin eating his brother alive. He didn't know that by the end of this month, he would be a traitor to his own bloodline. Nobody could have predicted the empire he would burn to the ground just to keep her safe, including Sang, especially Hawa. The sliding doors groaned as Myung hauled his brother's limp body toward the trauma bay. Blood the color of engine oil stained his midnight blue sleeve, but his eyes were fixed on the only person who hadn't backed away. Hawa stepped into his personal space, her hands already snapping on latex gloves. She didn't look at the jagged scar on Sang's brow or the glint of the pistol tucked into his waistband. Her focus was on Kylo's neck, where the veins were turning a synthetic, translucent black. "This isn't a heart attack," Hawa stated, her voice like ice cutting through the chaos. "It's a bespoke nerve agent. If I don't neutralize the pH levels in 3 minutes, his nervous system will liquefy." Outside, the screech of tires echoed through the bay as 3 black SUVs swerved to block the exits. Armed men stepped out, their faces masked. Sang didn't hesitate. He pulled the handgun, pressing the cold muzzle against Hawa's temple. He wasn't shaking. He was vibrating with a lethal, desperate energy. "You know what this is," he rasped. "That makes you the most valuable person in this city. You're coming with me, or we both die here." The tires screeched against the concrete of a derelict shipyard as Sang killed the engine. Inside a rusted shipping container, the air was thick with the scent of salt water and grease. This was no hospital. It was a tomb. Hawa didn't wait for an invitation. She slammed her trauma bag onto a metal workbench, her eyes scanning the empty space with a clinical, biting fury. "I can't filter synthetic toxins with a prayer and a stethoscope," she snapped, staring at the cold sweat drenching Kylo's ashen face. "I need a high-flux dialyzer and a portable ventilator. If I don't get them in 60 minutes, you're just guarding a corpse." Sang didn't blink. He checked the magazine of his weapon, the gold signet rings on his fingers catching the dim overhead light. "Those belong to the Kim Syndicate. They'll kill anyone who touches their supply line." "Then start shooting," Hawa countered, her voice steady as she began an IV line in the dark. "Because I'm not losing a patient today, and you're not losing a brother." Without a word, Sang vanished into the rain, leaving Hawa alone with a dying boy and the heavy silence of a war just beginning. The dialyzer hummed, a mechanical heartbeat in the hollow metal room. As the stolen machine filtered Kylo's blood, Hawa stared at the digital readout on her tablet, her brow furrowing. The synthetic toxin wasn't just complex, it was precise. She traced the molecular bonds, finding a sequence that acted like a biological lock. "This isn't just a poison, Sang," she whispered, her voice tight with a new kind of dread. "It's bespoke." Sang paused in the shadows of the container, his hand hovering over a fresh bandage on his arm. "Speak English, nurse." "It's coded to his DNA," she said, looking up as the dim light caught the obsidian depth of her eyes. "This toxin won't kill anyone else. It was designed to recognize Kylo's specific genetic markers before it activates. To make this, someone needed his full medical history, his blood type, his protein counts, his genome." The silence that followed was heavier than the storm outside. Sang's jaw tightened, the jagged scar on his brow twitching. To get that data, the assassin didn't need a sniper rifle or a silencer. They needed a seat at the Myung family table. The enemy wasn't at the gates. They were already inside. The hum of the dialyzer became the only clock that mattered. For 48 hours, the world outside the steel walls ceased to exist. Hawa moved with a rhythmic, exhausted precision, her scrubs stained with sweat and chemical residue as she fought the toxin's relentless advance. She didn't have to look at the door to know Sang was there. He sat on a low wooden crate, the midnight blue of his suit jacket now discarded, his shirt sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms corded with tension. He didn't speak. He didn't offer empty platitudes. He simply anchored the room. Every time Hawa reached for a fresh vial without looking, he was already sliding it toward her fingertips. When her hands shook from a drop in blood sugar, a bottle of water and a protein bar appeared at her elbow. In the sterile, suffocating silence, a shift occurred. It wasn't the warmth of a touch, but the weight of a shared burden. She realized he wasn't just guarding the entrance, he was guarding her focus. For the first time in her life, a man wasn't a threat to be managed, but a shield to be trusted. Their eyes met across the flickering monitors, a brief, heavy recognition of two survivors finally finding a mirror in the dark. The rain hammered against the corrugated roof, a frantic percussion to the violence unfolding inside the shipyard office. Sang's silhouette was a jagged shadow against the salt-stained windows as he hauled the rival boss, a man named Han, off the floor by his throat. Sang's gold rings were slick with crimson, his expression a mask of cold, focused rage. He didn't shout. His voice was a low, terrifying rasp that cut through Han's labored breathing. "The Toxin, Han! Who sold you the formula?" Han choked, his eyes bulging as he stared into the abyss of Sang's gaze. "I don't know what you're talking about, Myung. We hit your shipments, yes, but that poison, that's not us. That's high-tier tech. We're street, not lab rats." Sang tightened his grip, searching for the flicker of a lie, but he found only genuine, trembling confusion. Han wasn't playing a part. He was terrified of a weapon he didn't recognize. Sang felt a cold stone settle in his stomach. He dropped the man like a piece of refuse and stepped back into the downpour. If the rivals weren't the architects, then the call was coming from inside the house. The betrayal wasn't a business move. It was an inheritance. The blue light of the tablet screen etched deep shadows into Hawa's exhausted face. Her fingers flew across the keyboard, bypassing encrypted firewalls and digging into the molecular lineage of the toxin. She wasn't looking for a name anymore. She was looking for a signature. "I found it," she whispered, her voice trembling with a mix of scientific awe and pure horror. "The stabilizer used in this nerve agent, it's a patented enzyme. It doesn't exist on the open market. It's owned by a subsidiary called Aegis Biotech." Sang stepped forward, the smell of rain and cold iron clinging to his coat. He leaned over her shoulder, his eyes narrowing as he read the corporate registration. The air in the shipping container seemed to vanish. Aegis wasn't a rival. It was a phantom company, a shell buried under 4 layers of offshore accounts that Sang had helped audit 3 years ago. "Aegis isn't Han's," Sang rasped, his voice sounding like breaking glass. "It's a private holding of the Myung Foundation." He stood up, his face becoming a mask of absolute, frozen stone. The betrayal wasn't coming for him, it had raised him. The architect of Kylo's death wasn't an enemy, it was their father. The silence in the shipping container turned suffocating. Sang stood motionless, his gaze fixed on a rusted corner of the ceiling as if watching his entire world collapse in real time. Betrayal wasn't just a wound. It was a total erasure of the loyalty he had bled for. His father hadn't just targeted a rival. He had used his own son as a laboratory sacrifice. Sang's hands, usually steady enough to aim through a storm, began to vibrate with a suppressed, volcanic fury. Hawa didn't offer a hollow touch or a word of pity. She knew that for a man like Sang, sympathy was just another form of weakness. Instead, she stepped into his line of sight, her voice a sharp, grounding snap. "He's crashing, Sang." The words acted like a cold shock. Sang's eyes snapped to her, the marble mask of his face cracking just enough to show the hollow agony beneath. "Don't give him the satisfaction of a funeral," Hawa continued, her gaze unwavering. "Your father built this poison, but I am the one who breaks it. I need you focused. I need the base formula from his private vault. Do you want revenge or do you want a brother?" Sang drew a long, jagged breath, the predatory light returning to his eyes. The sun was gone, only the soldier remained. He nodded once, the bond between them tightening into a silent pact of war. The Myung estate loomed like a fortress of glass and cold ambition. From the backseat of a stolen van, Hawa sat surrounded by glowing monitors, her fingers dancing across a decrypted security bypass. She watched the grain of the infrared feeds, her heart thumping against her ribs in a rhythm she usually reserved for the operating room. "The north perimeter is clear," she whispered into the comms, her voice a steady anchor. "You have a 12-second window between the guard rotation. Move." On the screen, a shadow detached itself from the darkness. Sang moved with the lethal fluidity of a man who had designed the very security he was now breaching. He was a ghost in a midnight blue suit, slipping through laser grids and biometric locks that Hawa dismantled seconds before he reached them. "I'm at the vault," Sang's voice crackled, low and jagged. "Wait," Hawa hissed, spotting a thermal signature moving toward his floor. "There's a cleaner on the level, 3 meters to your left. Hold your breath," Sang. She watched him flatten against the marble wall, his existence reduced to a heartbeat. In that silence, the line between nurse and accomplice vanished. They were a single machine, fighting to steal life back from the man who gave it. The mahogany study smelled of expensive scotch and ancient betrayals. Chairman Myung sat behind his desk, a man of iron and silver who looked at his son not with love, but with the cold appraisal of an architect inspecting a faulty pillar. Sang stood perfectly still, his jaw locked to keep the fury from leaking through his skin. He had to be the loyal soldier one last time. "Kylo was weak, Sang," the chairman remarked, swirling his drink. "A lesson was required to see if you were ready to lead. Do you understand the necessity of pruning the garden?" "I understand, father," Sang lied, the words tasting like ash. In his ear, a faint static hummed Hawa's signal. While Sang held his father's predatory gaze, Hawa was miles away in the digital shadows, using Sang's proximity to bridge the vault's final encryption. She was the ghost in the machine, her fingers flying as she siphoned the chemical base formula and the DNA logs that proved the chairman's hand in the massacre. "Good," the chairman smiled, a thin, lethal line. "Then let us discuss your future." Sang nodded, knowing that by dawn, his father wouldn't have a future to discuss. The exit was a trap. The moment they cleared the estate's secondary gate, the air exploded with the staccato rhythm of suppressed gunfire. Glass showered the interior of the van as a black SUV rammed them from the side, spinning them toward the edge of a rain-slicked ravine. The metal case containing the antidote vials, the only hope for Kylo's life, slid across the floor toward the yawning open door. Hawa lunged for them, her fingers inches from the handle, but the van tilted precariously. In that split second, the math of Sang's life changed. The mission, the brother, and the vengeance were on one side of the ledge. Hawa was on the other. Without a flicker of hesitation, Sang ignored the sliding case. He threw his entire weight toward Hawa, wrapping a massive arm around her waist and pinning her against the reinforced seat as the van rolled. He used his own body as a shield against the shattering glass and crushing steel. As they came to a rest in the mud, Hawa looked up through the smoke. She saw the blood on his temple and the absolute, terrifying clarity in his eyes. He hadn't reached for the cure. He had reached for her. The silence between them finally broke, no longer professional but profound. He had chosen the healer over the cure. The confrontation didn't happen in a dark alley, but in the sterile glare of the Myung boardroom. Chairman Myung sat at the head of the table, flanked by lawyers and legends of industry, waiting to crush his son's rebellion. Sang walked in, but he didn't draw a weapon. Behind him, Hawa stepped forward, sliding a single encrypted drive across the polished wood. "You thought you were pruning a garden," Sang said, his voice a low, lethal vibration. "But you were planting the evidence of your own extinction." On the wall-sized monitors, the data Hawa had harvested flickered to life. The DNA-coded toxin, the shell company receipts, and the recorded medical files of a son sacrificed for profit. In real time, the Myung empire began to bleed out. Bank accounts froze, stock prices plummeted, and the board members recoiled like they were touching a corpse. Sang watched the light die in his father's eyes as the authorities moved in. He didn't pull a trigger. He did something worse. He stripped the man of his name, his wealth, and his shadow. Leaving the chairman sitting in the ruins of a hollow throne, Sang turned his back on the empire forever, walking toward the only person who remained untainted by the gold. The salt air at Inchinport was cold, but the morning sun finally broke through the soul fog. In a nearby clinic, Kylo was breathing on his own, the black toxin finally purged from his veins. The Myung Empire was a memory, a ghost story told in the boardrooms Sang had left behind. On the edge of the pier, a cargo ship hummed, ready to carry them toward a horizon where no one knew their names. Sang stood by the railing, the wind catching his dark hair. The Ice King was gone. In his place stood a man whose hands no longer trembled with rage. Hawa approached him, her steps silent on the weathered wood. For weeks, they had lived in the space between heartbeats and gunshots, bound by duty and survival. As she reached his side, Sang didn't look at the ship or the city. He looked at her. The professional wall, built of latex gloves and cold commands, finally crumbled. He reached out, his fingers tracing the line of her jaw with a tenderness that felt like a confession. Hawa leaned into his touch, her eyes closing as the weight of the world lifted. There were no more patients, no more bosses, and no more wars. Just Hawa and Sang, stepping onto the deck as the sun rose over a life that was finally theirs to write. Thanks for watching this episode of Dominus Tales. We're building a library of cinematic stories just like this one. If you want to support the channel, hit the like button and subscribe to stay notified of our weekly releases. Don't forget to drop a comment with your theories on what happens next. Your engagement helps us keep the Tales alive.